In 1977, the BBC broadcast The Talons of Weng-Chiang, the 6-part finale to the 14th season of Doctor Who. This is a serial that has found massive critical acclaim. It is consistently praised for Tom Baker's performance as the 4th Doctor, as well as its Sherlock Holmes-esque plot and the wonderful atmosphere created by the night location shooting. It appears routinely in top 10 classic Doctor Who lists, and even New Who has referenced its additions to the lore of the series. There's just one tiny thing working against it. It's really racist. I'm far from the first to point this out. It has been known for a while, even as far back as 1980. In some parts of the fandom, it's pretty known as just the racist one, but for some reason, the official Doctor Who channels have been wary of openly acknowledging this. Even the fandom had a strange relationship with it. Either people hail it as a masterpiece, or go, well, it's racist, and then sort of dismiss it. It's not a fact that I saw openly, widely admitted until 2020, when BritBox added a warning in front of their copy of the serial stating that it contains stereotypes which some may find offensive after a discussion about whether something of that nature should be allowed on public streaming services. Naturally, the Doctor Who fandom noted this change and moved on with their lives. Just kidding, there was discourse. Some maintained that the serial should be struck from streaming services in entirety, and others tried to argue that it wasn't offensive in the slightest, and those who say that it is are getting triggered. But is all of this true? Is it justified? Is the Talons of Weng-Chiang really that racist? Yes. The thing is, I literally could end the video there if I really wanted to. It really is that obvious that the serial is, to put it mildly, racially insensitive. But apparently even after official recognition of the insensitivity, people are still arguing about this. Some believe that the offensive material is just superficial, otherwise believe that it isn't racist at all, and everyone who says it is are a bunch of lefty crybabies sent personally by the woke media to make your kids dress in drag and fuck your dogs. I'm really beginning to second guess that line about fucking a dog. But this isn't the case. This serial is very unavoidably racist, and I think it's important to explore how it is rather than do what most of us have tried to do most of the time and just ignore it. So yeah, let's get into it. The Talons of Weng-Chiang takes place in late Victorian England. The Doctor lands on a misty night in London, intending on taking Leela to the theatre. Almost immediately he stumbles upon a murder scene and insinuates himself in the investigation. It becomes apparent that this man was murdered at the behest of stage magician Chang, as the man accosted Chang earlier that night regarding the disappearance of his wife. Chang had been kidnapping women in the night, bringing them back to a lair under the theatre to have their life force drained from them by a man Chang believes to be the god Weng-Chiang. In reality, Weng-Chiang is Magnus Greel, a 51st century war criminal who was crippled when he escaped his time in a very dodgy time machine, hence the life force sucking thing. The Doctor and Leela slowly peel away on this plot with the help of theatre owner Henry Gordon Jago and physician Professor Litefoot. Together, the four of them take on Greel, resolving to put an end of his reign of terror in London. Before we do anything else, we're going to have to build up some context, both for the show and personal context. We'll start with me personally. I know I shouldn't have to do a disclaimer to defend myself against the kinds of fans who are going to take it personally that I'm suggesting that Doctor Who did something dodgy one time, but I know I'm going to get accused of not being a real fan or some shit, so here goes. These are my Blu-rays of the David Tennant years. These are my Blu-rays of the Classic series. Here is my Blu-ray of season 14 of the Classic run, which contains the offending serial. There has been no more important show in my life than Doctor Who. For as long as I can remember, the story about the mystical alien with the box that's bigger on the inside has been a source of joy, of wonder, of escape. When I was in primary school, I turned in so much Doctor Who fanfiction for creative writing assignments that my teacher begged me to stop. I live and breathe this show. I love it with both of my hearts. I also think it's done some dodgy shit. These are not mutually exclusive. The other disclaimer I'm going to give here is that I will at no point be suggesting that if you like this serial, you hate Chinese people. I can't decide whether you should live or die. Not only would this be an unfair accusation to make, it would also be somewhat hypocritical of me. This is my copy of the second Beatles film, Help. This is a movie I enjoyed watching a lot in high school, as watching the Beatles pretend they can act while playing in the snow or doing whatever the hell this is could never get boring. However, the main plot of the movie is Ringo getting chased around the world by a thuggy cult who want to kill him because he's wearing a sacrificial ring. Several of these South Asian characters are whiteys in face paint. I don't think I need to explain why this is offensive. My point is, I really enjoy Help. So to intimate that liking a thing that has some dodgy shit in it means you're a raging racist would be an act of incredible hypocrisy on my part. So settle down, I'm not calling you a racist for liking Talons of Weng-Chiang. I am, however, calling the serial itself racist, and I do think if you're going to enjoy it, you should fully acknowledge that as a part of it. I want to shut up and get to the point now.
Just shut up and tell me the answer. Shut up and tell you the answer.
It is, of course, troubling that a show as beloved as Doctor Who would do something this offensive. But hey, it could be worse. It's not like some of the most beloved writers and directors to work on the show had their names on this, right? Oh, fuck. David Maloney is a pretty important director in the history of Doctor Who. His work encompasses some of the most important moments in the history of the series. Among his credits are The War Games, The Mind Rubber, Planet of Evil, and a more obscure, don't know if you've heard of this one, Genesis of the Dark. And as for Robert Holmes, well, anyone who's watched any classic Who knows his name. I don't think anybody in the history of Who besides Sidney Newman and Verity Lambert contributed as much to the lore of the series as Holmes did. This is the man who invented the Autons, the Master, the Centaurans, Time Lord Society as we understand it, and the 12 Regeneration Rule. Holmes's fingerprints are all over the lore of Doctor Who. But beyond that, he is well remembered for good reason for being a deft and clever writer. If the credits say by Robert Holmes, in general, you know you're in for a cracking good time, with memorable characters, clever dialogue, and inventive monsters. There is a reason he was the script editor for 3 years. And the thing is, this is why I understand why people like the Talons of Weng-Chiang. Holmes's creativity and wit is still well on display in the serial. The dialogue, when it's not being offensive, crackles with the wit that is his trademark. Jago and Litefoot, the double-act side characters, are endlessly entertaining. The serial even contributes the idea of the 51st century time agency to lore, an idea that seems like a footnote until Russell T Davies used it to set up the backstory of Captain Jack Harkness. The bugger of this serial is, yes, it is racist, but it is also exceptionally well written. When I was taking notes for the video, I kept getting sucked into this story by his writing, but he also really fucked up, as did Maloney in the directing. There is an interesting excuse people like to level when talking about this serial, that being the old classic, it was another time. Some things were acceptable back then that aren't now. It's a classic catch-all that we can't be mad at someone for being shitty in the past because, well, everyone was shitty then. And there are some instances of Doctor Who doing dodgy shit in the past that can fall under the umbrella of it was a product of its time, but this serial isn't one of them at all, because even when this one came out, it was understood to be offensive. In 1980, TV Ontario received copies of the episodes of this serial and geared up to broadcast them. However, before they could, the Chinese-Canadian National Council for Equality released a statement, stating that the serial contained dangerous, offensive, racist stereotyping that associates the Chinese with everything fearful and despicable. As a result of this statement, TV Ontario elected not to broadcast the serial in any capacity. This is, I think, a crucial piece of information in this discussion. If we just say, oh, it was a different time, and leave it at that, it stops us from having to think about it critically, I feel. But if it is acknowledged that even when people were seeing these episodes for the first time, they were understood to be offensive, it cuts away that dismissiveness. We can no longer just hand-wave it as a product of its time, we have to engage with this conversation. Which isn't to say I find it was a different time as a catch-all excuse anyway. Even if that were the case, we should still be acknowledging the serial for what it is. In general, it was another time might be a reason, but it sure isn't an excuse. Now that we have that out of the way, let's get into the serial itself. I want to deal with the superficial stuff super quickly because this stuff is just obviously wrong and I don't want to waste your time explaining to you why it's bad. Very extremely obviously, the man playing A.L.I.S.O.N, the lead Chinese character, is white. This is very obviously terrible. As I said, I don't think I need to explain why yellowface sucks. White people using makeup to appear as another race has been used to mock and appropriate others for ages, and it has always been degrading. But I think this example of it is especially shitty for two reasons. The first one is one that's immediately obvious when watching the serial, which is that there is absolutely no conceivable reason to do this. An excuse that I've seen once or twice to excuse brownface or yellowface in early television programs is one of actor availability. Oh, they may say, there weren't that many Asian actors in England at the time, so they had to use the makeup to get around that. I personally believe this to be a facetious argument for several reasons, but even making the broad assumption that this was a viable excuse, it sure as hell does not apply to this serial. Several unnamed Chinese characters appear throughout this serial in incidental capacities, frequently as Chang's henchmen. Most of these incidental characters are played by East Asian people. In fact, a Chinese Tong member who features prominently in Part 1 is played by an East Asian man. They could clearly find Asian actors to play Chang, but for some reason, they chose not to. No, let's not use the word they. David Maloney, the director of this serial, chose not to cast an Asian man as Chang. And the thing is, I do not enjoy putting Maloney on blast for this, because I genuinely consider his directing work for Doctor Who to be mostly top class. The War Games Episode 10 is a genuinely chilling piece of television because of his understanding of atmosphere. He somehow made the low-budget approach to the mind robber work in his favor, taking the dodgy models and sets and cardboard cutouts and turning them into something truly eerie. Hell, his direction of a misty and mysterious London in this serial is incredible. I really wish I could just call him one of Doctor Who's greatest directors and leave it at that, but I can't, because he made a decision that was just actively racist. And again, I'm not suggesting that Maloney woke up in the morning and went, you know who I hate? Chinese people. But his decision making here was racist. It's that cut and dry. And he's done this before. The War Games, that almost 10 out of 10 serial I mentioned earlier, has a white guy in face paint and a very bad accent play a Mexican revolutionary. Very cringe, David. Now, Maloney's not the only one to do this. I adore Patty Russell's directing for Doctor Who as well, but she also cast a white man in a non-white role in Pyramids of Mars. I mean, at least Peter Mayock wasn't done up in face paint to play the Egyptian Amin, and he doesn't appear to be doing a dodgy accent, but this still isn't great. Barry Letts had Patrick Troughton done up in what I'm gonna charitably call a questionable tan to play the Mexican salamander in The Enemy of the World, a choice that is not only made worse by Troughton's questionable Mexican accent, but also actively flies in the face of the doppelganger doctor concept the episode has on paper. This sort of thing has happened before in the show, but I find Talons to be the most egregious. Not only that, but Maloney's decision here and Patty Russell's casting for Pyramids of Mars mark a step backwards for Doctor Who. Let's flash back to 1971, the Season 8 six-parter, The Mind of Evil. It is a serial that heavily features the Chinese army for the first few episodes, after which they're suddenly no longer relevant to the proceedings of the serial, and they sort of vanish. An important character for these episodes is Chin Li, the captain of the security detail for the Chinese ambassador. You'll notice that she, and the ambassador, are actually played by Asian actors.
See, that wasn't so hard.
Now, some might be quick to point out that Pick Sen Lim, who plays Lee, was married to the serial's writer Don Horton. And yes, that is true, this made it easier for her to get the part, I imagine. However, on the DVD commentary, Barry Letts speaks of the casting process, making reference to working with an agency that exclusively worked to get TV contracts for Asian actors.
You'd been to an agency, I believe, called Oriental Casting, and I think you'd said to Barry, we're going to have trouble casting these parts.
I did, that's right.
Yes.
Christopher Coombe, who actually ran Oriental Casting.
That's right. He would send himself up for auditions whenever the right part came along.
So if this wasn't a hassle then, why was it suddenly necessary to cast Whitey as Chang in 1977? I find The Mind of Evil a useful example actually because it underlines Talons as a massive step backwards in another respect. There is a scene in part 1 of Talons where the Doctor speaks Chinese to one of Chang's henchmen, who has been arrested in the wake of the murder that kicks off this serial. Without looking into it too much, it is quickly apparent that Tom Baker is not speaking any of the Chinese languages.
Ni hao ma, inchima kora nampa tsika boronyo makarang udola sitsi.
That is not Mandarin or Cantonese or anything like that. He is making noises that sound vaguely like Chinese and just preempting it with ni hao in an attempt of passing it off. This sucks. Now, let's turn to The Mind of Evil. In this scene, the Doctor has a meeting with the Chinese ambassador, who speaks Hokkien rather than Mandarin or Cantonese. This episode is how I learned there are more than 2 Chinese languages. I am very white.
我派前路到我的国大。
感谢你请我来先生，我真欢喜拄着你真好心的人，都你无计去当的国。
In this clip, John Pertwee is actually speaking Hokkien. When Don Horton wrote the script, Pik-Sun Lim translated the relevant lines into Hokkien, so the exchange between the Doctor and the Ambassador was accurate.
And you did a lot of coaching for this, didn't you?
We taught him
Pik-Sun?
all that Hokkien.
I know
yes,
you
yes.
did. I know you did.
And again, I'm aware that Pik-Sun Lim, being married to the scriptwriter, lent an advantage to the proceedings here, but all the same, I do not imagine it would have been horribly difficult for Robert Holmes to phone someone up to translate or ask Philip Hinchcliffe to go looking for someone to do the work. But instead, they took the lazy approach, and the result is shitty racism. A common fan opinion I've come across in regards to this serial goes something like this. Okay, a hypothetical fan might say, the yellow face is terrible. The mock Chinese is bad. Nobody's arguing that. But if you fixed that and had Chiang played by a Chinese man, we would be fine and we could all go home for tea. Now, don't get me wrong, it would be less racist, but there are still fundamental problems baked into the script that hold it back from being fixed by a recast. One of the most immediately uncomfortable things about this serial is that the dialogue is chock full of racist epithets and slurs. Everybody from Magnus Greel to Jago and Litefoot has something to say about Chinese people. Some of it is casual racism, such as Jago consistently referring to the stage magician as the Celestial Chen. Now, if you didn't know that the word celestial in this context is a racial epithet, I'm not gonna blame you, because I didn't know either. First time I'd ever seen this, I had assumed that was a reference to Chang's Magic Act. But I've been following discussions relating to the serial The Celestial Toymaker, and the dodgy connections to racial appropriation that the original Toymaker has. This is a wild oversimplification, but basically his costume design is very much appropriated from Chinese culture to make him seem otherly. As I learned in these discussions, the word celestial reinforces that dodgy connection to Chinese culture, as it was used as an epithet for Chinese people throughout the 19th century. I didn't know that, but now that I do, when I went back to watch Talons for this video, that one jumped out at me pretty quickly. It also meant that I cringed a bit when this line popped up in the giggle.
We can be celestial.
So some of the racism displayed by the characters is more on the subtle side, such as the word celestial or Jago and Litefoot frequently using the word Chinese as a singular, i.e. a Chinese. But a lot of it is more overt. Magnus Greel on multiple occasions refers to the men working for Chiang as opium-addicted bunglers.
You're opium-addicted scummerol bunglers, Chiang!
Which is an unfortunate mix of racism and Robert Holmes' tendency for specifically phrased insults. And then this word pops up at least once.
Now, I've got a couple of inscrutable chicks.
Oh, you can't say that.
Now, here's the thing. If I have a major criticism of Russell T Davies' first run of Doctor Who, it's that it betrays a general lack of willingness to deal with the racism of the past. The Shakespeare Code has a scene where Martha asks if she's safe, a perfectly valid question given that she's black and suddenly in Shakespearean London, and the Doctor's response is basically just, don't think about it! Later in that same season, the Doctor is inadvertently written as being callous towards Martha's safety when he sets up shop in 1913 England in Human Nature, a deeply xenophobic environment that sees Martha cop racist shit from basically everyone around her, including the Doctor's human alter ego.
Mother, this is what we call a story.
What the fuck did you just say?
The Doctor's decision to bring Martha here goes utterly uncriticized because the show doesn't want to think about it. The point I'm trying to make is that ignoring that racism existed or not engaging with it at all is bad. The serial is set in Victorian England, which was a pretty hostile place for Chinese people at the time for reasons I will flesh out in more detail later. If Robert Holmes was going to write a script about a Chinese man in Victorian London, he would have to deal with the racism this man was going to cop just for existing. So things like Jago and Litefoot's casual racism or Chiang being verbally abused on the street make sense in the context of the setting of the serial. It's uncomfortable in the extreme, but it's not out of place in the context of the setting. What is out of place is that the serial at no point makes an effort to suggest that this racism is bad. I'm not going to say that every time someone says something racist, the show stop and someone turn to the camera like,
whoa, what? Guys, don't be like my friend here.
But Doctor Who as a show has always been about standing up for the downtrodden. The Doctor himself is a champion of the oppressed and by all logic would be annoyed at the very least at the bigotry on display here. Instead, the Doctor is present for a significant amount of this deep-rooted racism and makes little to no attempt to do anything about it. You know that clip I played of Lightfoot dropping the C word? The Doctor is in the room for that little chestnut, and he says nothing. It's actually worse than the Doctor not doing anything to challenge the racism around him. On a couple of occasions, he buys into it. Take a listen to how he describes the Chinese gang members when he discovers the murder scene in part 1.
Oh yes, we were attacked by this little man and 4 other little men.
What?
You mean to say the celestial Chang was involved in all these Machiavellian machinations?
Yes. Up to his epicanthic eyebrows.
It's so bad that even when Leela starts picking up on Lightfoot's racism, referring to Chang as the Yellow One at one point,
the Yellow One calls him Lord.
This also goes completely unchallenged. Let's flash back to 1973 for a second to the serial Frontier in Space. In this serial, the Doctor and Jo end up in the middle of an interstellar Cold War between the humans and the Draconians, one that it is threatening to get hot any time now. Throughout the serial, the humans refer to the Draconians as dragons, and it is clearly not well meant.
I found these 2 dragons in the hold.
At some point, Jo begins to use the word dragons, and the Doctor corrects her.
Yes, but why do they mistake us for these dragons?
No, Draconians. The dragons is rather an unflattering nickname.
The Doctor is pretty plain here, or at least as plain as he can be on family television in 1973. He knows that Jo didn't know any better, but still makes sure to basically say, that shit is racist, don't say it. What I'm saying here is the Doctor is massively out of character in Talons of Weng-Chiang to an extent that is frankly baffling. Incidentally, it's weird that Leela even begins to say this shit at all. If you're unaware, Leela is a far descendant of the crew of a spaceship that crashed on an alien planet. She has absolutely no context for Earth society, so anything she knows about Victorian England by the end of this serial, she would have learned over these 6 episodes. She hears all manner of racism from Lightfoot, but nobody refers to Chang as yellow in her presence for her to detect that as a phrase. The same goes for when she uses the word John Mulaney once called the laziest of all slurs, which was also a nickname for slow left-arm wrist spin bowling in cricket for some reason.
He said he'd seen a Chinaman outside the window.
My point is, nobody said these words around her, but she learned them anyway, by osmosis, I guess. I don't know, I felt like that needed pointing out. I want to take a minute to look at Henry Gordon Jago and Professor Lightfoot a little more, and how their characterization, or specifically their racism, is handled. One of the more identifiable tropes in a Robert Holmes script is the double act. A pair of comic characters with a delightful banter dynamic. Examples abound across the classic run of Doctor Who. The showman Vorg and Shona in Carnival of Monsters, the Gatherer and the Collector in The Sunmakers, and of course, Jago and Litefoot here. Due to Holmes's particular quirks in writing, they are extremely entertaining characters. Jago is a comic blowhard, so when paired with the more straight-faced Litefoot, they become a highlight of the show. But at the same time, they represent some of the biggest problems with this serial. As I mentioned earlier, Jago and Litefoot are pretty racist towards Chinese people. This might be expected, it's Victorian London, how many enlightened and sensitive people are you likely to find there? But again, it's in how the serial presents this bigotry that it massively fails. I'll begin with Jago because I think he's not quite as bad. The idea behind Jago is that, as I said, he's a blowhard. He falls well inside a classic comedy trope of do not take this person seriously at all, he's an idiot.
I'm a man of character and determination, sir. The Rock of Gibraltar would be more easily.
So when he says something off-color about Chang, the intended audience reaction is clearly something to the effect of, get a load of this guy. The serial still doesn't do much to address his racism, then sort of point and laugh at how stupid he is for saying it, but you know, it's a start. Lightfoot is a whole other beast. Throughout the serial, Lightfoot is presented as a well-educated and respectable man, someone we should have respect for. However, it is from him that a lot of the most shocking racism comes from. The racism the Doctor does little to nothing to confront. It also has a lot more of a hateful edge to it. Lightfoot is more active in his racism, casting dispersions on Chinese people wherever he can. It really feels like he just doesn't like Chinese people, as opposed to Jago, who seems to like everyone just fine, but is too ignorant to not know any better. As a result, he's a massively uncomfortable character to place front and center in the serial, especially given that his racism goes completely unchallenged by the serial and the Doctor. It's not a writing choice I understand in the slightest. Okay, that's not entirely true, because there's a thread buried in Lightfoot's characterization that with a bit of development could have worked out. See, it's established that his family had ties to soldiers fighting in the Opium Wars. The implication becomes that Lightfoot's bigotry is born of the fact that his family had a part to play in winning the wars against China for the British Empire. This is a perfectly good way to set up why Lightfoot is the way he is, but it completely fails to go anywhere. There are opportunities aplenty in the serial for Lightfoot to be confronted with his bigotry, but it completely fails to do so. The explanation for Lightfoot's racism becomes a lot less of a case of here's something that explains it, but it isn't an excuse and we will take him to task over it. Instead, it becomes a case of,
oh, well, that's all right then.
This is why a common excuse levied at this serial, that its depiction of this massive racism is to underline how bad it is, falls flat. This is especially the case because there have been serials that have depicted casual racism bluntly before in the show's history, but have also bothered to make it clear that those who are holding this ignorance are in the wrong. Hey, can we roll back to the Mind of Evil again?
We are going to see the new Chinese delegate, Mr. Fu Peng.
Fu Peng? He must be Hokkien.
No, Doctor, he's Chinese. Now, come along.
This is an excellent clip, because it perfectly shows what you should do if you want to show a character we're supposed to like having a character flaw like ignorance. The Brigadier is an almost universally beloved character in Doctor Who, but he's not perfect by any means. Being a soldier for both the British Army and UNIT in his life, he holds some antiquated ideas about the world. He's not actively racist, in fact he's quite the proponent for world peace, but he also just doesn't quite get it. This clip is a great example of how to handle that. It's a quick blink and you miss a joke, but the joke is squarely on the Brigadier for not getting it. The thing is, the Brigadier is pretty frequently used in the show for this purpose, to underline Britain's casual ignorance.
Well, naturally enough, the only country that could be trusted with such a role was Great Britain.
Well, naturally. I mean, the rest were all foreigners.
Well, exactly.
I really like this clip, not just because of the Doctor's sarcastic rebuke of the Brig's casual nationalism, but because the Brig himself realizes what he said was stupid when presented with the Doctor's commentary. It's things like this that Talons completely and utterly fails to do with Jago and Litefoot. There's even an opportunity where they could have had the Doctor rebuke Litefoot in a similar manner.
Things are coming to a pretty pass when ruffians will attack a man in his own home.
Well, they were Chinese ruffians.
Had Baker delivered his line with a bit more sarcastic venom, and had Lightfoot reacted the way the Brig does, this could have almost worked, but it would have also been too little, too late in that respect, given everything else he's let slip. Actually no, there is one occasion where the Doctor explicitly stands in opposition with Lightfoot's bigotry. However, it is still a bit odd. There is a moment where Lightfoot describes his father's funeral, which happened in China. I'll let this clip play out.
Fireworks at the funeral. Odd custom. Odd sort of people. What's up?
They use fireworks to frighten off evil spirits.
I know that.
This is the only time the Doctor expresses real irritation with Lightfoot. This not only confuses me because this is the one time it happens, but because it's bizarre to me that this comment, amongst all the other heinous things that Lightfoot has said, is what annoys the Doctor enough to say something. Okay, one might be saying by now. So all of this is pretty bad. A recast alone is not going to fix the problems at play here. Maybe it'll take a redraft of the depiction of racism as well. But then things will be okay. Oh boy, I wish that were the case. The thing about the Talons of Weng-Chiang is that even at its most fundamental level, it is rooted in racism. When writing this serial, Robert Holmes pulled from a great many influences. Among them were Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes stories, indeed the Doctor spends much of the serial dressed as Sherlock, and Jack the Ripper's infamous Reign of Terror. In addition, however, producer Philip Hinchcliffe urged Holmes to take inspiration from another pop culture icon, the villainous Doctor Fu Manchu. Fu Manchu is a character who is unavoidably entwined with racism. At the time of his inception, in the beginning of the 20th century, there was a significant amount of hostility towards Chinese people in Britain and America. In Britain specifically, this was a direct result of the Opium Wars. I've alluded to these wars a couple of times, but now it's time to properly explain what happened here. In short, British merchants had been illegally smuggling opium into China for years, as it provided lucrative trading opportunities and made the British Empire lots of money. However, Britain constantly pushing the stuff on the country took a toll, and it led to an unprecedented addiction epidemic. Horrified by this, the emperor demanded that any and all opium brought into the country be seized and destroyed. Incensed at the idea that they weren't allowed to keep pushing a viciously addictive narcotic into a country that didn't want it, Britain went to war with China over it. Twice! The end result of these wars was the occupation of Hong Kong and the legalization of opium in China, which only served to make the addiction epidemic worse. Through this colonialist campaign, the British newspapers did their part too. Through them, a vivid image of the Chinese was painted to the British public, that they were all opium addicts, that they intended on taking over the world and destroying the English way of life. that they were coming for white women. Moreover, the Limehouse district, a district in London largely populated by Chinese immigrants, began to pick up an image in the public eye as a den of criminality teeming with gangs and gambling and opium dens. These bigoted fears became the center of the idea that came to be known as the Yellow Peril, and were further reinforced by Charles Dickens' novel The Mystery of Edwin Drood. It was from these ideas that Fu Manchu was very explicitly born. Sax Rohmer himself, the writer of Fu Manchu, knew nothing of Chinese culture, his only familiarity with the Chinese being through the stereotypes and bigotry directed at them. As a result, the character of Fu Manchu becomes a racist caricature of epic proportions, a scheming, opium-addicted genius who is hell-bent on taking over the world and frequently takes innocent white women as hostages. He is served by fanatical cults who utilize mystic poisons in their arsenal. He is frequently depicted as having superhuman powers, such as that of hypnosis. If the Yellow Peril concept had a face, it would be that of Fu Manchu. This deep connection to racism would only be exacerbated when he came to the big screen. Invariably, in any film depicting Fu Manchu, he would be played by a white man in yellowface. And this finally brings us back to the Talons of Weng-Chiang. Somewhat ironically, just as Sax Rohmer had never read anything of Chinese culture, producer Philip Hinchcliffe had never actually read any of the original Fu Manchu novels. Instead, it seems likely he was influenced by the myriad films starring the villain, in the same way that 1950s Hammer horror films influenced the general tone of his run of Doctor Who. Based on these movies, Hinchcliffe instructed Robert Holmes to use the character of Fu Manchu as a direct inspiration for Talons. The results are immediately obvious. A.L.I.S.O.N Chang is a stage magician who uses powers of hypnosis to kidnap English women and take them to his lair. He is served by a fanatical cult who worship a god that, as far as I can tell, Robert Holmes made up for the purposes of the story. These fundamental facts of the story are Yellow Peril tropes, born from the bigotry of the period the serial is set in. However, there appears to be at least an attempt to subvert some of the tropes that Fu Manchu is based on. The biggest one is that A.L.I.S.O.N Chang himself isn't really the villain. Instead, it's Magnus Greel. Here, Greel is the scheming evil scientist, the one who is actually preying on the kidnapped women for nefarious purposes. He is the one who is revealed to be a ruthless dictator in his own time period, a war criminal on the run from his would-be executioners. In fact, A.L.I.S.O.N Chang is actually a really compelling character under it all. With the more evil tendencies fobbed off onto Greel, we get more opportunity to see what makes Chang tick. What we find is something of a tragic character. Chang was the son of a peasant who apparently had aspirations of being a famous showman. When Greel fell into his life proclaiming to be the god Weng-Chiang, Chang was ready to serve him. Not necessarily because he believed in Weng-Chiang, but because of the power that he offered. Under Greel, Chang was given the ability to be an unbeatable stage performer, being successful enough to not only bring his act to England, but in fact to be invited to play before Queen Victoria herself. Everything he does in the serial is in aid of his dream of putting on a show. He plays into the bigoted attitudes that the English have towards the Chinese on stage, speaking in broken English and thickening his accent for their benefit.
Please to keep very still. The bird has flown. One of us is yellow.
He does the same to dissuade suspicion on him when the police start asking him questions. A scene in which he betrays an irritation for having to play into these stereotypes. Here, his delivery has a sarcastic edge.
I've seen you somewhere before.
I understand. We all look the same.
When Greel orders that he kidnap women to sustain him, Chang agrees to keep his power. It's implied that he doesn't particularly want to do it, but the only scruples he voices are about whether he is found out as the kidnapper. Far from being an evil scheming genius, Chang is simply chasing a dream, losing sight of the terrible things he's doing for Greel in order to achieve that dream. When it all collapses around him, he attempts suicide by giant rat. Yeah, this giant rat is comically bad. The death scene that follows this is actually really tragic. Chang laments how it had all come to this, and is given the chance to have a truly touching moment before he passes. But the problem is, this attempted subversion doesn't work. It's too buried in the tropes that Hinchcliffe and Holmes are referencing that it can't break out from under them. Too much of the show's imagery connects Chinese iconography with the sense of doom rather than Greel himself for it to come off as anything other than yet another Yellow Peril story. This really sucks, as once again I can see a kernel of how truly great this story could have been if Hinchcliffe and Holmes were just willing to jettison even some of the tropes this serial leans on. It's a massive shame. The final question on a lot of people's minds may be, why keep banging on about it? This serial came out in 1977 after all. That's like in the past. We don't do that shit anymore. Why are we getting angry about a nearly 50-year-old piece of television? I think the first reason is fairly self-evident, that we have to continually point out the fact that it is in fact racist. A cursory scroll through any given Reddit thread about the serial will tell you that the insensitivity in this serial is still considered a point of debate in the fandom rather than a point of fact. Some believe it's only a little bit racist, others not at all. All of the excuses I've noted across this video, that it was a product of its time and all that, are fairly liberally used in debates like this. This dismissiveness of the content of this serial is why it bears talking about it all the time. The more we discuss it, the less you can just dismiss it. Now, I'm not suggesting everyone who defends this serial as not racist are themselves racists. I think it's more likely that it's just simply something they're not fully aware of. Take me, for example. I first watched this serial back in 2018 during a massive marathon of the entirety of Doctor Who. My initial takeaway was that, yes, it is racist, but only a little bit. Some shitty casting here, some careless dialogue there, nothing that can't be ignored. It's only the more that I listened to people who had concerns about this serial that I gained an appreciation for how deep this shit goes into the serial, how it is based on a racist stereotype at its core. So when I rewatched it for this video, so much more leapt out at me. All it took was sitting down, shutting up, and listening. But there's still a lot of resistance about. Why? I think it comes down to a fairly simple thing. We Doctor Who fans feel an obligation to go out to bat for our favourite show, no matter what. We point to the great stuff as examples of some of the best science fiction television ever broadcast, and when it's bad, we try to find excuses for it. In this case, this is a serial written by one of the show's best writers, directed by one of its best directors, and produced by a man who revolutionized the show at the time. In my mind, it is somewhat understandable that fans will bend over backwards to defend Holmes, Maloney, and Hinchcliffe on these matters. But I put it to you that in doing so, we're not being very good fans of the show. Yes, I consider Maloney a fantastic director, and Holmes to be a borderline writing genius. I truly believe Hinchcliffe did the show a massive favor by finding a way to balance serious storytelling with a whimsical twinkle by emulating Hammer horror. These people are unquestionably talented, but they cannot be exempt from criticism. If we portray their brilliance without ever addressing the ways they fucked up, what kind of message are we sending to people who want to get into the show? If the racism in this serial is treated as something we can overlook, what sort of impression are we making of not just the show and these writers, but of ourselves? And I don't believe it is contradictory to praise Holmes for being the brilliant writer he is, while at the same time pointing out when he was not good at all. The fact of the matter is, he's written some clunkers. Space pirates, anyone? If we admit when he did something shitty, that doesn't go back and erase Spearhead from Space or Carnival of Monsters or The Sunmakers. The same goes for David Maloney. Admitting that he did some racist shit with the casting of Chang doesn't magically mean that his work on The Mind Rubber or The War Games is any less good. If we're going to praise these people for all the brilliant work that they did, we can't be afraid to say when they did something bad. In fact, I think it's necessary. Otherwise, we are elevating these people to the status of infallible gods, something that would be very, very stupid for us to do. If we have these lofty standards for the work these people put into the show, we should hold them to those standards and criticize them when they fall short of them, and not just ignore it when it happens. And this applies to Doctor Who in general. I myself believe this show to be the greatest science fiction TV program to ever be broadcast. But sometimes it does something not so great. And when that happens, we have to hold it to the standard of being that good a TV show. Call it out when it does something shitty. I like to think we're getting better at this. Recently, Russell T Davies debuted Rose Noble in The Star Beast, Donna Noble's daughter. She is trans. This is a major step for representation in the main TV show and should be praised. In fact, it was. But at the same time, there was genuine criticism. A couple of lines at the end implied Rose's gender identity was directly tied to Donna's Time Lord meta-crisis. Dear old Russ has the only trans character on the show drop the old "did you assume their pronouns" in the middle of a scene discussing where the meat came from. A line that more annoyed me in execution than anything else. It was literally one redraft away from working. I could also bring up the scene where Rose is dead named by some school bullies, but apparently Yasmin Finney herself fought to keep that name, so I'm not touching that debate. My point is, people who make these criticisms aren't lesser fans for pointing out that this episode was inconsistent on the quality of its trans representation. Neither would we be if we point out other examples of it falling short. I think this is especially a standard we should be holding it to strictly because of the show's history with leftist ideology. We all like to say Doctor Who has always been progressive, and this is true, so we shouldn't ignore the times it wasn't. We should be actively calling it out when it fails to be progressive, when it does something backward and harmful. If an episode contradicts the general ideology of the show, it should be called out for it. We've all had a field day by now with the wishy-washy stance on capitalism that the episode Kablam took. We should have the same energy for Talons. Of course, we as a fandom do have another problem. Out of lack for other names for them, I'm going to fall back on the term for this general phenomenon, the fandom menace. These are the people who are just explicitly racist, who have been whinging about diversity in media anytime they see someone who isn't white on TV. This is a problem across several fandoms and has been brewing for a while probably, but ever since The Last Jedi, or in our case, the casting of Jodie Whittaker as the Doctor, they have been exponentially louder and more annoying. Somewhat surprisingly, I can't find any videos by the usual suspects like Nerdrotic or Bolstrick on the topics of Talons of Weng-Chiang. But I can tell you with certainty that their groupies were mad about it. When the news was going around that there were concerns over the content of Talons after it was made available on BritBox, they came out in full force. The bloody lefties are at it again, offended at everything. Sensitive little wussies. Doctor Who has never been racist ever, and if you think so, you're a soy latte drinking SGW. That kind of shit. What was clear is there was a complete lack of willingness to listen to someone who wasn't white, and a total refusal to think critically for longer than 2 seconds. I think this mentality is aided by the general dismissiveness that Talons is treated with. If we just hand wave it all away, it becomes easy to label anyone who doesn't like it as overly sensitive. More to the point, a lot of people who were mad claim the serial to be a top favorite, saying shit like, "Oh, so you're calling me racist for liking it? You fucking beta cuck?" Which is a telling immediate response. They also seem really mad about the idea of BritBox content warnings, going so far as to call it censorship at some point. Which is ridiculous, because the actual content of the serial wasn't altered. It's no different than those Looney Tunes box sets where Whoopi Goldberg does that intro like, some of this shit is massively racist, but we figured it's more responsible to not pretend like the racism doesn't exist. Usually this is the bit where I back this up with sources, but unfortunately my source here is personal experience. Despite having never watched his channel, I was for a time in a Facebook group for Nerdrotic's podcast somewhere around 2018 under the foolhardy notion that they simply didn't like Series 11 of Doctor Who for script quality reasons and not the actual reason they didn't like it. I like to think if I ever actually clicked on anything he published, I would have run like hell from that group faster than I did, but unfortunately I was there a while. I think I initially stayed in the group after working out what they were all about for entertainment purposes. Like, what are the bloody conservatives mad about this time? But after a while, the amusement of their rage was lost, and I left. Incidentally, the hate I saw in response to people calling Talons out as being racist was one of the last straws. The other one was a couple of months before, where I suggested that maybe we wait until the first episode of Star Trek Picard is out before we decide it sucks, and I got called the F-slur for it. My overall point is that all ignoring the problem or trying to reframe it as not that bad has done is ensure that some of these shitty tropes stick around. Because the general image of Talons racism is entirely superficial, that it's just in the yellow face and the use of slurs, we don't really notice when the more deep-rooted racist tropes continue to be used unchallenged. As late as 2010, yellow peril storytelling was still considered acceptable on British TV. You guys remember that one episode of Sherlock where Gemma Chan was a drug runner for a Chinese tong that operated out of a circus and tortured John Watson? Yeah, what the fuck was that? But this made it to air, because the Orientalists tropes that it uses aren't properly discussed. As a result, continued harm is done by the perpetuating of these tropes. This was allegedly also a problem with Legend of the Sea Devils. Rumor has it that massive sections of it were found to be deeply offensive to Chinese people and were haphazardly edited out last minute, leading to that episode turning out the way it did. I can't find any concrete evidence for this, and the episode itself was directed by a Chinese woman, so I can't concretely say this is true. But it was written by Chris Chibnall, so I can't say I'd be surprised if it turned out there was some questionable shit in that script. The point is, these harmful tropes are still alive and well and fly under a lot of people's radar because they aren't talked about properly or are ignored by the people who don't bring it up. The Talons of Weng-Chiang is racist. I imagine that much is pretty clear by now. But the thing is, this video probably isn't even the full picture of it. For example, I didn't mention things like Chiang's henchmen operating out of a laundry, another cliche, or the presentation of Mr. Sin, the killer puppet. A lot of the stuff to do with the Fu Manchu tropes I didn't even pick up on myself. Most of what I presented here on that topic was sourced from this article by Kate Allman written for the book Doctor Who in Race. Incidentally, that article is well worth a read. Allman came to a lot of the same conclusions I did on the topics that I did pick up, and her article is much more exhaustive than this video, I believe. While I had always intended on using clips from The Mind of Evil and Frontier in Space, it was her article that reminded me of this clip.
Fu Peng? He must be Hokkien.
No, Doctor, he's Chinese. Now come along.
So, what exactly should be the takeaway from all this? Truth be told, I don't know. My initial intention for this was to just be a quick and easy video stating what appeared to me to be the screaming obvious, but by the end of this, I've actually learned quite a bit. I suppose in that case my point is, listen? If someone's telling you that something you love has done something offensive, don't get defensive or dismissive. Instead, just listen. Learn something. That way, we can all do better.